Konnichiwa. It's a great pleasure to be here. I visited Kyoto many times since the first time I was here was in 1988. So that's 24 years ago. But this is my first opportunity to be present in an academic setting in Kyoto. I was mostly here for research conferences. This is, I think, my 7th visit to Kyoto. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Now, as you heard, this was going to be an interactive session, not just hands-on, but brains-on, as opposed to brains off. It's a talk about education. And in part, it's a talk about my experience as an educator. I started teaching at Harvard about 27 years ago in 1984. And when I started teaching at Harvard, I never asked myself the question, how am I going to teach? Strange, right? Because when you do something new, the first thing you should ask yourself is, how am I going to do it? But to me, it was completely clear what I was going to do. I was going to do to my students what my professors had done to me. And I learned physics in a classroom not very different from this room here, by listening to a professor standing in front of the classroom. So I began doing the same thing. And very quickly, I received signs that what I was doing was the right thing to do. What are the ways that we typically evaluate teaching? I don't know exactly about Japan because, as I told you, apart from some visits to university in the Tokyo area, this is my first visit to a university in the Kyoto area. But in the US, we typically evaluate teaching by asking the students to rate the professor at the end of the semester on a usually anonymous evaluation. Do you do the same thing here? Yes, I see several people shake yes. Now, usually, well, first of all, I should tell you that when I became an assistant professor, I was asked to teach the course that none of my colleagues wanted to teach, physics for pre-medical students. These were not students who wanted to learn physics. They hated physics even before coming into the classroom. And most of my colleagues, at the end of the semester, would come close to committing suicide because the ratings from the students were not very friendly. But not for me. I got very high evaluations. We evaluate on a 5-point scale. And I would get 4.5, 4.8 on a 5-point scale. So clearly the students liked what I was doing. So that's one way of evaluating the quality of teaching. The other is to look how students are doing on examinations. And even though I taught physics for pre-medical students, not physicists, but pre-medical students, I gave my students problems that I wasn't sure I could solve on an exam. But by and large, my students did well. So they liked me as an instructor. They did well on what I thought were difficult problems. Clearly, I was doing the right thing. Now, in retrospect, there were always some negative signs. I don't know if you have the same here in Japan, but in the US, at the bottom of the questionnaire, you can write comments. And even though most students would give me high ratings, some students would write at the bottom of the questionnaire, physics is boring, or physics sucks. I could not understand that. I mean, what is more interesting than understanding how the world around us works? So I didn't understand why students said that, and I ignored it. The same thing happens when I go to a party and people ask me what I do for a living. And if I tell them I'm a physicist, the reaction invariably is, oh, physics? I had such a hard time with physics in high school or in college. Recently, I was at my dentist, and I couldn't even speak back, because I had this thing in my mouth, and he said, oh, you're a physicist. I got an A, which I think is your 5, right? I got an A for physics in college, but I really didn't understand anything. I always get very embarrassed when people make these remarks, but I couldn't understand. Now I think I know why, but I could never understand why, so I just ignored these negative signs, and instead I focused on the positive signs, the high evaluation, my students' performance. And for many, many years, that illusion, because it was an illusion, of being a good teacher continued. And I kept lecturing, and the students did well on my exams, and they gave me high evaluations, and everybody was happy. But then later, we'll get to that in a second, I discovered that it was just a house of cards, a complete illusion. Now, this talk really is not about physics. You already heard Professor Yoshi say that. It's a talk about education. I will have a few examples from physics because I'm a physicist and I'll have to put it into some context, but really what I'm telling you has nothing to do with physics. And in fact, my approach to teaching has been applied from the humanities to philosophy to ethics to, French drama to different sciences. So it's not specific to physics. Now, you all have one of these little clicker devices, and there's always a danger starting a talk on education with technology. Because a lot of people think, ooh, technology, the magic bullet, the solution to all problems in education. Unfortunately, I think most use of technology in education is simply a new way of doing old things. New wine in old, or old wine in new bottles, or new wine in old bottles, doesn't matter, same thing, right? I think the only good ways of using technology is if they allow you to do something that you could not do before. Well, I want to start this talk by a little exercise. And in that exercise, I want you to think about your own education. And we're going to use these clickers not in a pedagogical manner. We're just going to use them initially as a tool for me to get your responses. So here's what I would like you to do. I would like everybody to take a little piece of paper. And on that little piece of paper, I would like you... Oh, before we do that, hang on, wait a minute. Before we do that, let me explain to you how the clickers work. Oops, pardon me. You should have one of these in your hands. If you don't have one, raise your hand, and then somebody will give one to you. So they don't have an on-off button. They're always on. If you press a button, any of these buttons, you should see the same number appear in that window. Don't press the channel button. We want to keep channel 41, but you can change the channel. If you accidentally press the channel button, this little light will flash. Just wait until it stops flashing. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and you're going to press a button corresponding to an answer. If you change your mind, you can press again. So if you press 2 and you think, oh no, I should have pressed 3, and you press 3, the 3 will replace the 2. You don't get to vote twice. You can only vote once. Let me actually show you what Oh, and by the way, if you press 4, you will see 4 here. If you press 9, you will see 9 there. So I'll show you, first of all, what I see as an instructor. I have this little window that floats. If I press this button, you can now vote. So why don't you all press a button? Just press a button. Any button, right? And you can see here at the bottom that this number increases, showing how many people have responded. Right now, 89, 90. If you've already clicked and you click again, it won't go up because it only counts you once. I can press on this and see the distribution. Many of you like button 1 and button 5. I guess it's because they're in the middle of the clicker. Why don't you all press 1 now? 1. Everybody. Very good. I like it when my audience follows instructions, and you're very good at that. So notice that the distribution changes instantly as you change the buttons on which you press. If I hit the stop button here, now the distribution is frozen. If you press on a button now, you will see that there on the little window there's a circle with a line, meaning you cannot vote right now. Also, when I press the stop button, it takes a picture of the screen behind it. So tonight, I can review the data, and I can see this graph, and I can also see the screen behind it, so I remember, oh, this data goes with that question. And it works with any presentation software you want, including Microsoft Word or PDF or you name it. Very simple, but I think that's important because when you teach, you don't want to deal with complex technology. Now, turn the clicker around. If you look on the back side, you will see that there is this barcode, which is a unique barcode. So you may think that you're anonymous. No, you're not anonymous, because each time you press a button, it sends the button plus the barcode. Of course, we didn't register who got what clicker, so you are really anonymous. But in a classroom, you could actually track students' individual answers. Okay, so now that you've seen how they work, let's do this little exercise. I want you to take a little piece of paper, and I want you to think of something you are really, really good at, something you're proud of. And there are two signs of that, right? I mean, it could be making music, it could be gardening, it could be cooking, it could be solving partial differential equations, it could be reciting works of literature, it could be photography, painting, anything. Something you enjoy, something you know other people respect you for. And ideally, I want that something to be a skill or a knowledge that has been important in your career. So take a few seconds to write down something. You won't have to tell anybody, so it's private information. But I do want you to write down something. Okay, well, I see that most people are looking up. This should not be too hard. You are all very successful people. So now comes the hard part of the exercise, because now I want you to think how you became good at whatever it is that you wrote down. Where did you learn it? What did you do to become good at whatever it is that you wrote down? Now that's a tough question, because the things that we enjoy doing, we learn almost naturally. And you may have to think deeply where and how you learned it. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to write down a few words describing how you became good at whatever it is you wrote down. Now, I have done this little exercise all over the world. A few months ago, I was in South Africa. Earlier this year, I was in Seoul, Korea. This summer, I was in Beijing, China. I've done it all over South America, North America, Europe. And I've collected the answers to the second question. And they're always the same. There are very few differences. There are no cultural differences, which is not surprising because we're all human beings and we are all programmed to learn the same way from the moment we're born, essentially. So it's not that surprising that the answers don't vary. So let's see if the Kansai area of Japan is any different from the rest of the world. So I've collected the answers, and they typically fall into the following categories. I learned it, or I became good at it by trial and error, by trying it and learning from my errors. I learned it by listening to lectures. I mean, I'm emphasizing the word listening here, right? Because giving lectures is very different from listening to lectures. I became good at it by practicing. Or another one here, I became good at it by apprenticeship, by doing whatever it is that you wrote down together with somebody who's already a master and learning from the master. And then there are some other categories like friends and family and so on. So I want you to press the button that corresponds most closely to what you wrote down. And if nothing corresponds, then you press 5. So go ahead. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to wait a few more seconds. We're almost at 100 here. And let's see what the distribution is. There we go. And indeed, it's no different here from anywhere else in the world. The most popular choice is practice. Typically, the percentage in that column is between 53 and 60-some%. And as you see, you're here 55. We learn by practicing. We learn by doing. By, in the words of Professor Yoshi, being active. Now, that's not why I did this little exercise. Because if you look carefully, there's something else that is interesting about that distribution on the screen there. What is it? And you can say it in Japanese. If you say it in Japanese, then I'll listen to my English translation. But what is the other interesting thing about that distribution? Number 2. Look at that. Only 1%, one person, poor person. Only one person said that he or she learned this skill by listening to lectures. Now, why is that surprising? It's surprising because all over the world, how do we teach? That's how we teach, right? So you've all just said that something that was really important in your life, you learned it not this way, you learned it by practicing, yet all around the world in institutions everywhere, and there's no difference. In fact, this is a picture of me. Here I am, right there, teaching my introductory physics course to pre-medical students a long time ago. This was BC, not before Christ, before computers. You can see there's no laptop here. There's an overhead projector, and I'm projecting it on the board. So we see right at the beginning here already that there's something strange there. We've shown that the way we learn is not in sync with the way we teach. So here's what I would like to do today, and the outline is at the bottom of my screen there. I will first talk a little bit more about education. What is it that we mean when we use the word education? Many of you are educators. I'm an educator. But if you were to ask me to write down a definition of the word education, or if I were to ask you to write down a definition of the word education, I think many of you would find that very difficult. We know what we mean when we use the word, but it's very difficult to actually articulate it, which is strange, right? Because as educators, we should know how to define what we do. So I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by education. Then I'll talk about PreInstruction. I developed PreInstruction not because I wanted to develop PreInstruction. No, I developed it because I discovered, and I'll show you that discovery, I discovered that even though my students gave me high ratings in this setting, and even though my students did well on the exams I gave them, they were not actually learning at a deep level. They were simply memorizing things by rote. So I'll talk about PreInstruction, and since we're in an academic setting, we're going to end this with a test. So you better pay attention because I'm going to test you at the end of this presentation. So let's start with education and ask ourselves the following question. What is it that happens in a lecture? I mean, take this picture, for example, of me teaching a long time ago. What is it that is actually happening there on the screen? I would like you, and you can do it in Japanese if you want, somebody will translate for me, but I want you to describe the process that is taking place on the screen there. I want you to use a verb. But the two verbs I do not want to hear are teaching and learning. You have to use other verbs to describe what is going on there. So give me a few, just shout it out. Okay? Abstract. Disseminating. Is that what you said? Disseminating what? You must have heard my talk before. You know, normally when I do this in audiences, I get things like writing, talking, demonstrating, sleeping. You know, and there's something interesting about sleeping. I'll talk about sleeping several times, but I recently read a quote by a French writer by the name Albert Camus, who wrote, "Some people talk in their sleep. Lecturers talk while other people are sleeping." I hope you're not sleeping while I talk, but you know, there's some truth to that. But obviously my students are not sleeping. But I think that the gentleman there said the right things. Lectures focus on the dissemination of information. Some people will say dissemination of knowledge, but I don't know exactly what knowledge is, and I don't think you can disseminate knowledge. The only thing you can do is disseminate information. And you know, my students had actually told me that, but I had ignored it. See, when I was asked to teach this course, I didn't ask myself, how am I going to teach it? What do you think was the question that I did ask myself? Put yourself in my position and they tell you, teach introductory physics. What's the first question that comes up in your mind? It's not that hard. Huh? Exactly. What book am I going to? It's not the how, it's not the approach, but what book? So I went to a colleague who had taught the course before, and I asked him that question, and he said, well, in this course, we have used a book by the name of Halliday and Resnick. The two authors are Halliday and Resnick. If there are physicists in the audience, they probably know that book because it's been a classic for many, many years. Now, I was educated in Europe, and in Europe, students typically do not buy books for introductory courses. Why buy the book? Why spend the money if the professor is presenting the content of the book to you? So I was at first not expecting that the students would buy books, but then my colleague said, you have to make sure that the bookstore has enough copies of the textbook, because they're all buying the book. So I went to the bookstore near Harvard University, and I made sure that they had 150 copies of that textbook. And as I walked back to my office, I said, wait a minute, if they have the book and I have the same book, then what do I do in the class? So I went to my colleague and I knocked on his door and I asked him that question. And he said, oh, don't worry, there are lots of different physics textbooks. Well, you had a whole shelf full of them. And I started to look, and very quickly I found the perfect book. It was perfect for two reasons. The first reason was it was different in approach than the book that I used, so it was not the same. But that was not the important reason. The important reason was that the book was out of print. The students could no longer get a copy of it. So for every class, I spent 10 hours preparing lecture notes, and in class I would either project the notes, as you see here, or I would write the notes on the blackboard. And because my approach was a little bit different from the book that they had bought, I gave my students a copy of the lecture notes at the end of each class period. Now, why do you think that I hand them out at the end and not at the beginning? Well, I handed them out at the end because I wanted them to pay attention to me. Actually, that's not the reason you didn't get the notes today. You didn't get the notes today because the answers to the question I'm going to ask you are printed in the notes. But in my classroom, I didn't want students to get the information just from the notes. But if you stop to think about it, isn't that already admitting that there is a problem? Why force the students to come and get the information out of my mouth if they could get it from the notes? Anyway, I never thought about that. But what happened was that after 3 weeks, some students came to me and they said, Professor Mazur, couldn't we get a copy of your lecture notes at the beginning of each class? This way we don't have to write down that much. And I had indeed noticed that each time I went A on the blackboard, 150 pens went A in the notebooks of the students. I once heard somebody describe the lecture as a process whereby the lecture notes of the instructor get transferred to the notebooks of the students without passing through the brains of either. And that's precisely what was happening in my class. They were just copying what I was writing, but the place where the information really needed to get didn't get there. So I started handing it out at the beginning of each class period. And the following year, I decided, rather than issuing my notes one class at a time, what I'm going to do is, before the semester starts, I'm going to take all the notes for the entire semester, send it out for duplication, and on day one, they received, 250 pages of notes for the entire semester. You know what the result was? The unexpected result was that about, 6 to 10 students wrote in their evaluation, Professor Mazur lectures straight from his lecture notes. Hello? I mean, what was I supposed to do? Write another set of lecture notes to lecture from that was different from the lecture notes I gave to them? I was angry. I was mad. But the students had a point. I was lecturing from my lecture notes. I was focusing on the transfer of information. So that yields... That means we could ask the question, given that classes all over the world are like this, we could ask the question, is that what education is? Is education simply the transfer of information? I hadn't thought about it, but let's do it. Let's do a little poll. If you believe, so use your clickers, if you believe that education is only the transfer of information, you press 1. If you think education is more than just the transfer of information, you press 2. So go ahead. 1, education is just the transfer of information. 2, education is more than just the transfer of information. Okay, let's see what we have here. And as again, that 1%, you see that? I think we most agree that education is more. I'm worried about that 1% because I'm worried that that person is going to lose his or her job. Because let's imagine for a moment, let's imagine that education is just the transfer of information, right? Let's imagine that. What would be the logical thing to do? What should we do then? And I need some feedback from the audience, okay? I've only heard from 1 or 2 people here. So let's hear from this side now. If education is, and you can say it in Japanese, and Professor Yoshi or somebody else will translate it for me. So you can say it in Japanese, it's fine. But what would be the logical thing to do if education was just the transfer of information? Have students read the textbook, exactly. Or in this internet age, what could we do? We could put the lectures online. We could take a video of the best lecture, right? In Japan, you would take it in Japanese. In China, you would make it in Chinese. In English-speaking countries, you make it in English. But you just take the best professor and you put it online. What would we lose by doing that? What is it that we would lose by doing that? Will we lose anything? Well, waiting to hear something here. What will we lose? Ah, interaction. I hear several people now say interaction. But how much interaction is there in a real lecture? I mean, look at the interaction right here now. I'm working really, really hard to try to pull information out of you. It's not easy, let me tell you. It'll work better towards the end when you warm up. But it's hard. There is no interaction. Most students do not want to interact. When I was lecturing like that, I would stop and I would say, does anybody have a question? Anybody has a question? And you know how students are. They look down, right? They don't want to make eye contact, right? There's no interaction at all, or hardly any. If you wait very long, it's always the same person in the front row who asks questions. Most students do not want to interact. So by putting it online, you do not lose much. But you would gain a lot. Because online, you can do things that you cannot do in the real world. Have you ever had a student in your class raise his hand and say, Professor, could you please be quiet for 5 minutes? I need to think. I've never had that in my class, right? Or a student who raises his hand and said, Professor, could you please repeat the last 10 minutes? I need to hear it again. Right? Online, you can do that, right? You can put pause and think, or you can go back and listen to it again. Or you can stop and call a friend and say, hey, do you understand what Professor Mazur says at 8 minutes and 21 seconds? Right? So you would gain all of those benefits from putting it online. So if education, as this one person said, is just the transfer of information, I am afraid that we will all lose our jobs. Because very quickly everything will be online. However, the good news is that 99%, including me, believes that there is more. There's more to education than just the transfer of information. So now, to the 99% here, I'm asking, what is it? What is it that is needed in addition to the transfer of information? And again, you can say it in Japanese and somebody will translate it for me. What else is education in addition to the transfer of information? Well, 99% said there's more, so I need to hear from you. What is it? Yes? Learning from each other, exactly, which, you know, does not really happen inside a classroom. As a learner, you need to do something from that information, with that information. It's not just taking the information from the instructor, putting it into your head. No. You need to make sense of that information. Connect it to your experiences, to what you already know. Build mental models. Have the aha moment, right? So much education is simply instructors presenting information to students, and then you wait 1 or 2 months, and on the exam, the student gives the information back to the instructor. But that's not really what education is. A lot of my education, even in Europe, where I was educated, very much followed that model. The professor gave me information on the exam, I had to give the information back. The way I learned history, for example, a collection of facts. In what year did the Dutch defeat the British just outside London? I don't know, I've forgotten, I'm sorry. I can probably Google it, but I've forgotten. But I memorized it long enough to pass the exam and be admitted to the university. Did I learn something that is useful? No. Could I have learned something that was useful? Yes, absolutely. I could have learned why this historical fact happened. What were the circumstances that made it possible for the Dutch to defeat the British on their own territory just outside London? I don't know, because I never learned. I only learned the date. Not that long ago, I was at the University of Connecticut, which is just south of Boston. I gave a talk in the physics department on education. And after my talk, one of the professors came to me and said, I had something really interesting happening in my class this year. He had worked very hard on making physics relevant to the students. And in order to make it relevant, he connected it to baseball. There's a lot of physics in baseball, right? I mean, trajectories of balls, collisions between bats and balls. So in the classroom, he would give examples out of baseball. On the homework, he would put baseball problems. On the exam, he would put baseball problems. At the end of the term, he was writing the final exam. And as he was writing the final exam, he realized he had run out of baseball problems. So he put some football problems on it. Professor, complained the students, we've never done any football problems. I'm sure you recognize some of your own students or maybe some of your own experiences, right? I think that if you're unable to transfer what you've learned from one context to another, you have not really learned. And unfortunately, that holds true for many students. For example, let me show you some of the results that I obtained in my class when I was still teaching a very traditional class following the lecture model. And I'm going to show you some data that I obtained with a test called the FCI, or Force Concept Inventory. I know this is not a talk about physics, but I'm going to give you a little bit. I have to show you my own data here because that's the only data I have from my own classroom. But let me tell you a little bit about physics instruction. In a typical physics course, in week 1, you describe motion. In week 2, you introduce the concept of force, which is described by Newton's laws. And then week 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on, build on top of that concept of force. Force is like a basic building block of physics. If you do not understand force, it's very difficult to understand anything in physics. Well, in 1990, I read about this FCI. It was published in a magazine of the American Association of Physics Teachers. And the person who developed this force concept inventory, which is a multiple choice quiz if you want, said that there's very little difference between how the students do on the FCI before they take physics compared to after they take physics. In other words, they learn almost nothing. I read that and I thought, it can't be true, right? But then he showed a table how this applied to teachers who had gotten high and low evaluations at the end of the semester. He had given it to students, to students of teachers who had won teaching awards. Do you have teaching awards here in Japan? Do you give teaching awards? Yeah, based on student evaluations. Yeah, okay, so same thing in the US. So he looked at the pre-test data. Pre-test means at the beginning of the term, and post-test at the end of the term for the award-winning teachers. And then he looked at the same difference for the dullest, driest, most boring teachers you can imagine. And you know what? There's no difference. The award-winning teacher does not have more learning gains or does not cause more learning gains in the students than the dull, dry, boring teacher. I saw this and I thought, no way, not my students, not Harvard students. Right? I mean, we are a very selective institution, so I thought my students, in fact, most of the students who come to Harvard already have had at least 2 years of physics. So I already assumed that they understood forces before they started. But I'm a scientist, so when you're a scientist, you learn one thing, namely not just to make statements. So I thought I'm going to show that my students at Harvard are different. And one day, I came to my class and I said to my students, look, I'm going to give you a quiz. I didn't want to call it a test. You know, pre-medical students, if you use the word test, they panic. So I said, I'm going to give you a quiz, and you don't have to worry about this at all. It's not going to affect your final grade in any way. I'm just using it to test the effectiveness of my own teaching. When I said that, I realized I'd just taken away all incentive for them to take it. You know how students are. If you tell them it's not going to affect your final grade, they won't even show up, right? I don't know how it is in Japan, but that's certainly true in the United States. So I thought, I better make sure that my students actually take this quiz seriously. So I said, look, next week we have an exam. If you take this quiz seriously, it will help you prepare yourself for the exam. As soon as I said that, I realized I told them a huge lie, because the exam dealt with much more complicated things than the FCI, which was just the concept of force. So I was worried that my students would be offended by the simplicity of this test. I was wrong there, because as soon as they started, one student raised her hand and she said, Professor Mazur, how should I answer these questions? According to what you taught me, or according to the way I usually think about these things? I remember standing there thinking, I don't know how to answer that question. And by the time they had finished the FCI, it was clear that I had a big problem. So what you see here is a histogram showing the results. On the horizontal is the score. As you can see, some students got 29 out of 29. According to Hestiness, anybody who scores below 23, which is about 70% of my class, has not understood the concept of force, is still partially a so-called Aristotelian thinker. If you take a gorilla and put the gorilla behind the keyboard pressing, random keys, you get about this. As you see, I have some gorillas in my class, right? Now, I've used this FCI now for more than 20 years in my class, and, unfortunately, this is only the post-test after I teach. Let's compare to how it is at the beginning. I didn't do it in 1990, but in the next 3 or 4 years, this was the pre-test. So now compare the pre-test at the beginning of the class, blue, to the post-test at the end of the class, red, and you can see there's not much difference, right? There's not much difference, and this is the most basic thing. So let's compare that to some other universities. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the blue distribution, and take the average and put that on the horizontal axis, which is 70%. Then I'm going to take the red distribution, take the average, and take the difference between the two, 78% minus 70, so the change caused by my teaching is just 8%. That's it. That's all. If you start at 70, you can go to 100, right? So 30. So you see that my students, instead of gaining 30, only gained 8. The reason I'm showing it this way is because this allows me to compare to many other universities. Here you see some 2-year schools and large state universities and one private university. And you can see that everywhere these data points are far from that line. So no matter what the level of the students, and this has been done in China, I mean, it's the same, and there's no cultural differences there either. If you lecture, you gain only 1/4, right? And 1/4 here of the maximum possible gain. Well, when I thought that, I thought, how can this be? Maybe, Eric, you're not such a good teacher? But that could obviously not be true, right? I mean, I just knew that could not be true. So what other possibility of explaining this poor result? Dumb students. But you know, at my institution, where we have a very select group of students, that's hard to claim, right? So I thought about it some more, and then I came up with the perfect excuse. I thought there had to be something wrong with this test. Maybe it was the FCI that was wrong. And I started to do some testing of my own. I don't have time to go into the detail here, but I basically ended up finding out, and if you're interested in hearing more about this, there is a talk that I have given many, many times, which you can see on YouTube, called Confessions of a Converted Lecturer, where I show more data. Today I want to get a little bit more engaged here. But what I found was that students were able to do the textbook problems very well, but they were not able to understand the basics. Why? Because they simply learned to follow procedures without understanding the underlying procedures. Now, that of course, you know, if you're happy with that, that's fine. But I think we want our students to be able to do more than that. We don't want our students simply to be able to follow examples and only be able to solve those examples. There are many problems in the world. Energy, water, natural resources, conflict, problems that we don't know how to solve yet. We want the next generation of students to be able to solve those problems. I don't want my students only to my level. I want my students to stand on my shoulders and reach higher. Right? We want the next generation to build on what this generation is able to do. So simply teaching our students what we can do is not good enough. We have to go beyond that. So the point I really want to make here is that it's not just the transfer of the information, but it's the assimilation of the information, and that was not happening in my class. So think about your own education. Where is it that assimilation of information? Piaget would basically call it accommodation of information, but I'm using the simple term assimilation here. Where did that happen for you? I've often asked myself that question. Where would the moments occur where I said, oh, I understand it now? Did that happen while you were sitting in a classroom like this one, listening to the instructor? I don't think so, right? It happened outside of that classroom. So, to get now to the second part of my talk here, PreInstruction, I like to think of education as a two-step process. One, transfer of information, right? We need transfer of information. And secondly, as a learner, you need to make sense of that information. Now, in the traditional approach to teaching, step one happens in the classroom, And step 2 happens outside of the classroom, right? I remember, after class going over my notes and thinking, why did this professor do this, right? And then think, and then, oh yeah, that's why. Right? It happened in isolation, or sometimes I would consult another students. If you ask yourself, which of those 2 steps is the easy one, I think we would all agree the transfer of information is the easy one. The hard part is making sense of that information. So it's kind of strange that in education we mostly focus on one and leave the much harder step 2 to the students on their own. So what I decided to do, after discovering how little my students at Harvard were actually learning, was to switch this around. Instead of doing the transfer of information in class and leaving the hard part to my students, I was going to ask the students to do the transfer of information out of class before coming to my class, and then in class I helped them assimilate that information, make sense of that information. So now I still give my notes to my students, but before they come to class, they have to read the notes, or they may have to watch a lecture online that I have given before. Why give the same lecture year after year after year after year? Why not tape it and then have the students watch it? I don't expect them to understand everything. In fact, I don't expect them to understand very much by the time they come to class. But at least I don't want to waste their time, and therefore my time, by basically reading the textbook to them. And then I can use the class time to actually help them make sense of the information that they have either seen or read about. So what is happening in that second step? Let's focus, because the first step is easy now, right? We have books, we have online courses, we have massive online courses. There's Coursera, Udacity, edX. I hear that at Kyoto you are starting an effort in delivering courses online. So this part is easy. What is it that you do in class in order to help students assimilate? And that's where PreInstruction comes in. And the idea is very simple. Rather than teaching by telling, I now teach by questioning. That's not something new. 2,000 years ago, Socrates, the Greek philosopher, already said we should teach by questioning. Here we are in the 21st century. Most of us are still teaching by telling. So I'll get into class, I'll talk a few minutes, and after a few minutes, I will pose a question. After I've posed the question, I give students time to think in silence. I don't want them to talk to each other, right? So they can actually think. Normally in a lecture, you cannot think. There's no time to think. But here, they can think. After they've had time to think, I collect their answers, now using clickers. Before we used other techniques. And after they've answered the question, I tell them, please turn to your neighbor and try to convince your neighbor of your answer. Complete chaos. Now, this was sort of an accidental discovery. And I discovered it in the following way, that this method worked. After I gave the FCI the first time, I told you a few minutes ago that I was worried that the students would be offended by the simplicity of the FCI. They weren't offended at all. In fact, the students were very worried by how poorly they'd done on the FCI. So they asked me to organize a special session where I went through every question on the FCI. And there was one question, I remember that very vividly, where I explained it, right, by making a drawing on the board. And then I turned around, and I could at once see from the faces of the students that they were confused. So I asked, does anybody have a question? They were so confused, they couldn't articulate a question. You know how it is, right? If you're very confused about something, it's difficult to to ask a question. So I knew this was very serious. So I erased the board and I started again. And for 8 minutes, I gave the most brilliant explanation you can think of. I turned around. They looked even more confused. And they were still not able to ask a question. I didn't know what to do. I tried for 10 minutes. Something that in my mind was very simple. So I didn't know what to do. But I knew one thing. I knew that half of them had given the right answer on the FCI. So I said, why don't you discuss it with your neighbor? And the whole classroom, 150 students, erupted in chaos. I said, wow, you know, this is amazing. I've never seen this in my classroom, right? Normally, it's as silent as it is here. People don't want to interact, quiet. But when I asked them to talk to their neighbor, they all talked to their neighbor. And in 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, they figured it out. They all agreed on the right answer. I had tried for 10 minutes to explain it unsuccessfully, and in 2 minutes, they convinced one another. I thought, how's that possible? But imagine 2 students next to each other, John and Mary. Mary has the right answer because she understands it. John does not. On average, Mary is more likely to convince John than the other way around. But, and this is the most important part, Mary is more likely to convince John than Professor Mazur in front of the class. Why? Because she has only recently learned it. And she still knows what the difficulties are that a beginning learner has. Whereas Professor Mazur learned it such a long time ago. To him it is so clear that he can no longer understand why somebody does not understand it. It's what my colleague, the psychologist Steven Pinker, calls the curse of knowledge. I'm making sort of a strange argument here, right? Because usually we tend to think that the more of an expert you become, the more qualified you are to teach. I'm making sort of the opposite statement. I'm saying the more you advance in your knowledge, the more difficult it becomes to teach a beginning learner. Because you forget. You forget how you learned. You forget the difficulties that a beginning learner has. So that's why I decided to try to build that into my approach to teaching. So they talk, and then after a few minutes, I polled them again. So pre-discussion poll, post-discussion poll. And it's not unusual to see the numbers go from 50% to 90%. The only condition is that there are enough students who have the right answer before the discussion. The ideal window is somewhere between 35 and 70%. If less than 35% have the right answers, there are not enough students to teach each other. If there are more than 70% right answers before the discussion, then, you know, they turn to each other, they agree, and they'll start talking about something else, right? So the ideal question is one where you have between 35 and 70% correct answers. Then I explain, and after explaining it to them, we repeat the cycle. And the whole hour, you know, that I teach, or 90 minutes, the cycle continues. Question, discussion, question, discussion. Well, question, discussion, explanation, and so on, okay? And of course, the learning takes place in the discussion that is there. Let me show you a little video clip of how this works in practice. So we have a rectangular loop. So I read the question with them. Magnetic field in the direction indicated. Don't worry about the question. So the question is, what are the magnetic forces on the 4 different sides of this loop? So take a minute to think about this, and then enter your answers. So, and after they think about it, after I talk about it, they think about it. I can see on my screen how they vote. We have but I don't show it to them. Disagreement clearly here. And as you could see, there are 2 equal answers. So turn to your neighbor and see if you can convince one another of the correct choice.
Right. It goes out of the page and half goes in, so they cancel each other out. There is a torque. There is a torque.
How do you know that?
I said torque.
You can see the data streaming.
But it happens to be a torque. Oh, so it was right.
Did you see the aha moment there? Ah,
Initially, we
right?
had sort of an even split. And now we have an absolutely overwhelming majority for choice number
See,
2.
and initially,
The bottom
1
of
and
this
2 were
loop
the
is
same. Now
towards you.
2,
The top
almost
is
everybody
pushed
had
away.
2. That's
What is
not
that?
unusual to
Okay,
see
that's
that.
torque.
I do not show the first distribution. I do show the second distribution. So what is happening here? One is it's active, not passive. It is impossible to sleep through my classes because every few minutes your neighbor will start talking to you. Okay? It's just impossible to sleep. Second is that there's now a two-way flow of information. There's not only information from me to the students, there's information coming back. If they do not understand something, I see it immediately. I don't have to wait till the midterm examination or the final examination. I discover it right away, and I can still do something about it. What's more, the students have an opportunity to continuously assess their own knowledge without being afraid of getting it wrong. Right? Because if they get it wrong, there's no consequences to it. And if, after the second answer, you are in the small percentage who still has the wrong answer, at least you have a little warning there. I should look at this. So, how good is this? What happens? Well, before I show you the data, why don't we just try it so that you can try it out yourself and feel what it is to be a student in such a class. Do you want to try it out? Yeah? Okay, good. Did you all read that little handout that I asked Professor Iyoshi to distribute about thermal expansion? There's a 1 page, 2 paragraphs. No? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just making a joke here. But you know what that means. Because you did not prepare yourself, I will have to lecture you. Okay? So I'll have to give you a little mini lecture about thermal expansion. And then I'll ask you a question about thermal expansion. Thermal expansion. It means that when a solid material, like a metal, when it heats up, it expands in volume. It's true for all solids, wood, metal, you name it. It's most pronounced for metals. And it has some important consequences in engineering. For example, I'm sure you've been in trains. Of course, Japan has trains all over the place. In the Shinkansen, you don't notice that. But in other trains, you hear this clickety-clack sound when the wheels of the train go over gaps. The reason there are these gaps is so that the rails can expand when they get hotter. This is a railroad in India where they forgot to put gaps, and you see what happens. The rail expands and then it buckles. And that's pretty bad because trains derail then. Steel beam buildings. I don't think this is a steam beam building, but there are many tall buildings that are built with steel beams, pardon me. You need to take the expansion into account. Now, the reason materials expand is that they're made of atoms. I'm showing 9 atoms here. And in particular for metals, when the material heats up, the distance between the atoms increases. So this is a cold metal, and that's a hot metal. Right? Cold, hot. I heard in a taxi the other day that you say hoto, but maybe that's just a Japanese translation of an English word. Okay, so cold, here, hot. Right? The reason is that atoms don't sit still. They move. Right? So if you were atoms, you wouldn't sit like this. You would actually shake. Right? And the amplitude of the shaking is what we call temperature. So this is a hot atom, and this is a cold atom. Hot, cold. Now, if you vibrate more, you need more space. Right? So as they vibrate more, they push each other apart. That's all you need to know. Cold, hot. not only those 9, all of them, absolutely all of them, okay? Good. Questions, anybody? No questions? Cold? Hot? Now, look, I mean, one thing I could do is I could make this dark, and I could ask you the question, when metals get hotter, they expand because the atoms, A, get closer together, B, stay the same distance, D, get, go further apart. But that would not be interesting, right? Because then I'm giving you information, you're giving me the same information back. I'm going to see if you can take this model and apply it to a new context. So you better ask me questions before I ask you questions. No? Nobody? No, it's completely, I knew I was a really good lecturer, so maybe cold, hot. No? Ready for the question? Last chance to ask me a question. Last chance. Otherwise I'm going to ask. Raise your hand. Don't be afraid. Huh? Okay. I warned you. So here comes my question. And don't talk to each other. So here are the instructions. What I want you to do, I'm going to hide this for a moment. What I want you to do is I want you to think about the question. Think about this model of the atoms getting further away. Then answer the question in silence. No talking to your neighbor. After I tell you, I want you to talk to a neighbor. If you turn to one neighbor and you have the same answer as that neighbor, you say, thank you very much, and you turn to another neighbor. Do not talk to somebody who has the same answer. Find somebody with a different answer. Maybe you'll get to meet somebody new in here, which is, kind of fun. If you find somebody with a different answer, you try to convince that person that you are right and he or she is wrong. And then once you've convinced this person, the game continues to try to find somebody else, okay? But just don't talk to somebody who has the same answer. So consider a rectangular metal plate with a circular hole in it. When the plate is uniformly heated, what happens to the diameter of that hole? Does it increase? Does it decrease? Or does it stay the same? Take a minute to think about this and think about the reasons, and then select 1, 2, or 3. Okay, so I'm going to give you 30 more seconds. And if you've already voted, think in your mind, how am I going to convince the person next to me? 15 more seconds. 10. So now, if you don't know, if you still don't know if it's 1, 2, or 3, make it a game. But you have to press a button, okay? So if you have not yet pressed 1, 2, or 3, just guess. But you have to press a button, okay? So go ahead. This has to go up to 100 there. So, and remember, I want you now to find somebody who has a different answer. If you need to get up and walk around, it's fine, right? Find somebody who has a different answer, try to convince that person, and then continue until I stop you, okay? So go ahead, find somebody who has a different answer. Go ahead, talk to each other, okay? Everybody, if you don't talk to somebody, I will come and talk to you, okay? Now look at this. I mean, you should see it from here. Hello? I mean, look, I can't even get control back. Hello? I don't know what hello in Japanese is. Look at them there and there, right? Everybody is smaller. Everybody here is engaged, fired up. I mean, imagine I just continued my lecture, right? Imagine I'd given my little lecture. See, they're still talking. the two there. I mean, they're so engaged, they're still talking. Imagine I'd given my lecture about thermal expansion, and then I would have said, and now we're going to apply this to a rectangular metal plate with a circular hole in it. If you take a rectangular metal plate with a circular hole, and you heat it up uniformly, the plate will expand, and the diameter of the hole will... I'm going to keep you in suspense a little bit longer. The answer actually doesn't matter. The point I wanted to make, because I'm not here to teach you physics, probably you're all thinking right now about this plate. You want to know the answer of this plate. If I had just given the lecture, you would have just written it down and not be engaged like this. You wouldn't have cared about whether the hole got smaller or bigger, right? But now you're dying to know the answer. If I were to say goodbye and leave, you would come running after me saying, what's the answer? What's the answer? Right? So why don't you answer it again? So I want you to vote again, second time. I want you to indicate what you now believe to be the correct answer. So if you had 2 and you have not changed your mind, you press 2 again. But if you change your mind, you press whatever you now believe to be the correct answer. So please enter 1, 2, or 3. What you believe after the discussion with your neighbor. Okay, so I'm going to keep you in suspense a little bit longer. Okay, because again, this is not about physics. So I want to analyze a little bit what happened here before I tell you the answer, right? Well, what did you do exactly? The first thing you did is you thought about this question, and then you made a commitment. I had you express your answer. You pushed a button, right? And after pushing that button and making the commitment, you had to externalize your answer. You went to a neighbor and you said, I chose answer 2 or 1 or 3, right? And the thing that happened was that in the discussion, your discussion moved from the answer, which could be conceived as a fact, to the reasoning. It was not the hole gets bigger or smaller or stays the same. No, it was, I think that the hole gets smaller because blah, 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 right? Some kind of an answer. You had a deeper discussion than just the answer. But the most important part, perhaps, is that you became emotionally invested in the learning process. You are dying to know what the answer is. Even though, let's face it, it's not very interesting whether a hole gets bigger or smaller, right? It makes it so much more engaging and interesting. Now, unfortunately, I have some bad news for you. I thought I gave a very clear lecture. And you thought I gave a clear lecture too, apparently, because nobody asked a question. Only 28% got it right. Only 28%. So that means out of every 4 people, only 1 had the right answer. I told you, you need a minimum of 35% for the method to work. This question was a little... I am very, very curious, because with 28, you know, there are very few people who were able to teach their neighbors. So I'm not sure it will have worked this time, so let's look. I wanted to show you the distribution as it is now. And actually something quite remarkable has happened. It improved, not a lot, because the correct answer went from 28% to 32%, which is not very great, but, you know, that's unfortunately the truth here. The question was too hard. It's number 1. Now look at that. I can see many of you think, bigger, smaller. And again, you've forgotten that I'm not here to teach you physics. I'm here to show you the engagement. Now, I don't want you to lie in bed tonight. By the way, here are the 2 distributions. Let me show them both. Here you see the two distributions together. So initially we had 28% there, so a little change, but not a great change. Usually when there are more initial correct answers, the changes are much more dramatic. Now, I don't want you to lie in bed tonight and think, why does this hole get bigger? Right? So let me try to explain it to you. Imagine that you have a jar of pickles in the refrigerator. It's a glass jar and it has a metal lid. You take it out of the refrigerator, you try to open it, you can't open it. What do? You put the metal lid under hot water so that the ring expands. The hole gets bigger. Well, maybe that's not that convincing, right? Because you say it's not a rectangular metal plate, it's just a ring. So, but imagine that we have a rectangular metal plate and no hole in it. There's no hole. It's just a rectangular metal plate. We take out a pen and we draw a circle on the plate. And now we heat up this plate and the plate expands. What happens to the circle? Everything gets bigger, so the circle has to get bigger too, right? You say, well, that's not fair, because if there was a hole, then the metal would expand into the hole. But let's just consider the atoms at the edge of the hole. So this is the metal, this is the hole, and these are the atoms at the edge of the hole. Right? Imagine that it's a beautiful day outside, we could all go outside and we make a big circle like that. We are the atoms at the edge of the hole. And now we hold hands and now we all step inside towards the center of the circle. What just happened to the distance between us? Here? This is the original hole and now we step towards the center. What happens to the distance? It gets smaller. It cannot get smaller, right? Because there's more shaking going on, right? The only way to make the distance larger, the only way to make the distance larger is to make the hole larger. You won't forget this. And again, you're probably thinking physics. This is not about physics. It's about engagement. And the only thing there are 2 points I wanted to make. One is, my lecture was not very good. You did not get it, right? And the second point I want to make is that as a student, it's a very different feeling to be in a classroom where you are actively engaged than when you're just a passive receiver of information. So, back to PreInstruction. How good is it? What does it do? Well, let's first look at the FCI again. 1991 was the first year that I used PreInstruction in my classroom. First year. Right? Here's the pretest. Some gorillas, some really good students, okay, at the beginning of the course. At the end of the course, no more gorillas. Yes, there are still some students who don't understand Newtonian mechanics, but it's much smaller percentage than before. And now, if you put the two distributions together, you see that there is quite a change between the two. Instead of a 8% gain, we have a 16% gain. This was 1991, the first year. Later on, the data point went up further because I asked better questions. The questions that I just asked you about the hole in the plate would not have been a really good question because it would be too hard to get good discussion going. And I think this point there, which was obtained by 2 of my colleagues, not by myself, is actually as close as you can get to a perfect score as possible. What about other institutions? Here are data points from these institutions. And you can see that all of them have gone up, except for one here. And if you take all of the data, you don't just select the best ones, you see that implementing PreInstruction doubles the learning gain in a physics class. But the FCI only tests forces. Physics is much more than forces. What about textbook problems? I knew my colleagues would ask me that question. Yeah, it's good that you do all this thing in class, but what about students' abilities to solve problems. So how do you answer that question? I knew of only one way, and that was to repeat an exam. I had never, ever repeated even a question on an exam. Every year I had a totally different new exam. 1991 was 7 years after 1985, or 6 years after 1985. I thought, you know, no student will have access to these old exams. But I'd still kept data, so I was able to make this histogram of exam scores out of 100% for my class. You see, some students got very high scores, some did not do that well. The average was about 62%. Now, between 1985 and 1991, my class had grown in size from about 100 students to 250 students. And I was worried that my students' exam performance would actually go down a little bit for two reasons. One is because the class had gotten so much larger, but the other reason was that in class I had not done any problem solving, because I had decided that students don't learn from watching me solve problems. I mean, imagine you're studying to learn to play the piano. Do you learn to play the piano simply by listening to famous piano players playing the piano? Mitsuko Shida or right, somebody else? No. You have to play the piano to learn to play the piano. Do you train for a marathon by sitting in front of the TV, eating popcorn, looking at DVDs of marathon runners? No. You have to do the running. Do you learn to solve physics problems by watching a Harvard professor solve problems? No, you have to do the problem solving. So in 1991, I decided that my students didn't derive much benefit from watching me solve problems. Yes, we still had homework. They still had to do problem solving for the homework, but not simply by watching me do it. But you know what? In 1991, they actually did better. Statistically significantly better. And we especially help the students at the low end here of the distribution. So what does this mean? This means that better understanding leads to better problem solving. Actually, if you stop to think about it, that makes sense, right? I mean, if you understand the basics better, you become a better problem solver. But and I think this is the most important thing, most important message of my talk. If you just look at good problem-solving performance, that's not an indicator of real understanding. Remember, when I taught a lecture class, my students did very well on the exams, but they didn't understand the basics. They were simply solving problems by following examples. And if you then go from a baseball problem to a football problem, they can't do it anymore. They can only solve it in exactly the context that they've learned it, which means they haven't really learned it, and they certainly will never be able to solve the real problems that humanity faces. Because we want them to solve the problem we have not yet solved. So let's go back as a closing thought to the lecture. And ironically, I realize I am giving you a lecture about not lecturing. But I'm very happy you invited me to give a lecture, because when I teach, I don't give lectures anymore, and I miss giving lectures. So you're giving me an opportunity to do some lecturing. So what happens in a lecture? In a lecture, students, or the audience in general, doesn't pay its utmost attention. And you know what? I recently saw some beautiful data out of MIT that showed that this is really true. At the Media Lab in MIT, they developed a sensor that you can wear around your wrist. It's a little sensor. And it measures electrodermal activity. Electrodermal activity is very strongly correlated with brain activity. It's not that strange, right? Because the nerves that run through your arm are connected to your brain. And the article shows, most of the article shows that whatever you measure at the wrist is very strongly correlated with what you would get by putting electrode in people's heads and measuring actual brain activity. But the great thing about this is that you can put it around your wrist and you can walk around and record data. So they gave it to some MIT students and recorded their electrodermal activity for a week. So day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. And if you look on the horizontal scale, here, if you look on the horizontal scale, you can see that it starts at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't know why at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Maybe students at MIT, that's when the day starts. Not at my institution, the day starts in the morning. But anyway, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then it goes on here till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And you can see here the activity. High when there's a lot of brain activity, low when there's little one. Now, underneath it, but the letters are very small, so you can probably not read it, it shows the activity, lab, study, and so on. I want to draw your activity, I want to draw your attention, pardon me, I want to draw your attention to the activities labeled class. Look at what happens to the brain activity in class. The trace goes flat. Compare that to sleep. In other words, the students are more asleep in class than they are in their own bed. If you're interested in this article, the digital object identifier is here, and you'll get a copy of this after my presentation. There's only one activity, one. Don't try to read the little letters, but think about it. There's only one activity that has the same characteristics as lecture. Think about it. Don't look at the screen. What do you think that is? Ask yourself, in your daily activity, what is it that is similar to watching a lecture? Listening, but listening to what? Other than a lecture. Watching TV, exactly. Look at that. There's TV, there's TV. It's completely flat. And this is something that people knew already a long time ago. Well, a long time ago, 40 years. 40 years ago, people did brain studies of people watching TV. And they noticed that brain activity goes to 0. People become like a vegetable in front of the TV. And the reason is very simple. The mind likes to wonder. You know, you like to dream, to think about things, to think, right? I mean, that's why many people find reading a book more enjoyable than seeing the same movie that the book represents. If you ask people, what did you enjoy more, reading the book or watching the movie? Almost everybody says reading the book. Because when you read the book, you are in control. You are in control. You can stop and think and dream and imagine. When you are in a movie, this information comes at you. There's nothing to think. It just comes at you. In a lecture, it's the same thing. So it's actually not that surprising that the brain goes flat. All we can do is take the information in, maybe writing it down. There's no time to think. On top of that, you walk away thinking you know it. You thought you knew it when I told you about thermal expansion. Only 28% of you knew it, right? The reason is you had not been confronted with your misconceptions. You had had no time to actually think about it. And you know, this happens very often to me. I'm sure that in your departments, you have weekly seminars, or maybe every 2 weeks. I mean, we invite people from Yale, Caltech, Europe, Japan to come and give a talk every week. And sometimes I'll go to a talk and I hear this brilliant talk. And 2 hours later, I'm walking, in the corridor of my building, and a colleague comes to me and says, "Did you go to that colloquium by this person from Yale?" I say, "Yes, I went." "How was it?" "Oh, it was great. It was really good." "Really? What was he saying?" And that's when you all of a sudden realize, it all sounded very good, and I enjoyed it, but I cannot reproduce it, right? So in the end, you know, you walk away with this false sense of security. You think you know it, but actually you don't. And it turns out it's all really an illusion, a house of cards. And in closing, I hope I've convinced you that education is not just about transferring information. We live in an information age. There are so many ways to disseminate information, right? What matters is not just this transfer or getting students to know what we do. We have to actively engage the learner in the learning process. The emphasis should not be on the teaching, it should be on the learning. The learning experience should not be focused on the teacher, it should be focused on the learner. And that also already shows you that this type of space is not ideal, right? Why are you seated like this so that all the attention is on me? But all the attention really should be on you. And certainly that should be true for our students. Lastly, I also want to emphasize that my talk is not about technology, it's about pedagogy. You can do this without technology. When I started doing PreInstruction, there were no clickers, they didn't exist. We could have done exactly the same thing by just putting the hands on the chest. You could have said 1, 2, or 3. I could have said to all of you, put your hand on your chest and indicate what your choice is, 1, 2, or 3, like this. I would have seen it, you would not have seen it because you look at the back of the person in front of you, right? And then I would have asked you to talk to each other, and it would have been just as dynamic and active. So it's not the technology that matters, but the pedagogy. So I'd like to end by showing you 2 opportunities. One is that we have the first international conference on PreInstruction in Beijing, China at the end of this year. You can write to me if you want more information, or Google it and find the URL. If you're already using PreInstruction or interested in it, we have a social network called PreInstruction.net where you can find other people in other fields. And you can find materials on PreInstruction and a blog on PreInstruction. So for anybody who is either an expert or a beginner, this should probably be the first resource to turn to. Lastly, if you want to download my slides, you'll get a printed copy, but if you want to download it, you can go to my website. You don't have to write it down. First of all, it will be in your notes, but you can just go to Google, enter my last name, and then hit this I'm feeling lucky button, and then you'll have a copy of it. Thank you very much.